Greetings, it is I, Countess Naravan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time to continue my discussion on the history of Magic the Gathering, where I take you set by set, expansion by expansion, going over the entire history of Magic the Gathering, so you get aware of all the information about it. So, let's continue where we left off with Saviors of Kamigawa. This was the third set within the Kamigawa block and the second small set within it. It was released on June 2nd of 2005 and it had 165 cards. Now, it continued a lot of the themes from the first set within the block, so the themes of the block with Arcane, Spiritcraft, and Soul Shift, but it primarily focused on the mechanics of flip cards, Wisdom, which are card-in-hand manners, and it introduced three keywords: Channel, Epic, and Sweep. Now, its symbol was a toro, a traditional Japanese lantern that is usually placed within temples, and it represents hope. Now, as I said, it continued many of the mechanics from the previous sets, including spirits and all of their abilities. It also continued to have a large number of legends within it, but it did a few other things. It introduced the first flip card, which when it would flip, it would change its permanent type. So these flip cards changed from creatures to enchantments. It also introduced the first card with a no mana cost. I mean no mana cost, not even zero, had no mana cost with Evermind. So it was sold in 15 card booster packs, of course 4 pre-constructed decks, and a fat pack. Its pre-release was on May 21st of 2005, and had foil alternate art card of Kiyomaru First to Stand. It had a release card too in Ghostlit Riders. Now it was accompanied by a novel to tell the story called Guardians, Saviors of Kamigawa. The story itself focused on the Ronin Toshi, who had been, to best of his ability, trying to stay out of the Kami War. He didn't want to really take either side in this sort of conflict, but because of his connections to Michinko, the daughter of Konda, and her attempts to basically stop the war, he's driven into this point in time where he's trying to help out Michinko to basically stop the war before the spirits basically hit their final blow and finally defeat the mortals. Now, of course, it continued all the mannerisms it had within tournaments and the ways it was being played within tournaments as the previous sets. It still had the same sort of dislike for confusing mechanics and too many legends, but also, the various combos that existed within it and the ways that people were playing continued. Now, as I said, it had 3 keywords and a new mechanic that it introduced. The first of the keywords was, of course, Sweep. With Sweep, when you would play a card, you would return a certain number of lands of a type mentioned on that sweep for a greater effect. The more of those lands you returned, the more of the effect you would have with the sweep. I basically move a whole bunch of a type of land to my hand, have an effect. Channel allowed you to play a spirit effectively, and rather than playing it as a creature, you played it as a spell effect. What this would actually mean is you would effectively pay its channel cost, discard the spirit for an effect. Because of the nature of this, it wasn't an actual spell you were casting and therefore couldn't be countered. It counted as a card effect or a creature effect. So anything that would counter an ability would counter this, but countering a spell, no. And the last one, of course, was Epic. Epic was a spell that was so powerful that when you played it, you were no longer allowed to play any more spells for the rest of the game. What Epic allowed you to do, though, after that is every time at your upkeep, the spell that you cast that was Epic would be repeated. So effectively, you would then cast the Epic spell, or a copy of it, every one of your upkeeps, but you couldn't cast any other spells at all. Now, the mechanic was, of course, Wisdom, which had to do with the number of cards in your hands. Traditionally, with the Wisdom, the more cards you had in your hand, the more potent effect it was. And it also sometimes related to the number of cards you had in comparison to your opponents. Now, this had 9 cycles and 1 vertical cycle. Of course, the first cycle is the Ascendants. The Ascendants were rare flip cards that, when they would flip over, at certain conditions, they would become a legendary enchantment. They were legends to begin with that would become legendary enchantments. It had a cycle of Bouncers. These creatures that when you put them into play, during your upkeep, you returned a creature that matched the color to the bouncer to each controller's hand. This was a way for a lot of come-into-play effects with the same color. There was a cycle of Epic spells. Of course, these were spells, rare ones, with the Epic ability. The Ghostlet cycle were uncommon spirits with the channel ability. Kirans were legendary 5/5 flying spirits, which each of their own spirit craft linked to mostly their color. They had a cycle of Marus. These legends had power and toughness equivalent to what the number of cards your opponent had in their hand. So effectively, the number of cards they had linked to how big and powerful it was. They had Maru spells, which were spells intrinsically linked to the Maru legends that I just mentioned. The Ona were uncommon spirits with come into play abilities that when you would play a spirit or an arcane spell, you could actually return the Ona to your hand, possibly to play it again. And finally, the Shinin were uncommon creatures with come into play abilities or a channel ability, your choice was which one you would use. The vertical cycle was a cycle of black spells called recursors that effectively when you could return this black spell from your graveyard to your hand if you had more cards in your hand than an opponent. So basically you had more cards, you could return it to your hand. Now it had 4 mirror pairs, including Hand of Cruelty and Hand of Honor. It had, of course, 5 functional reprints, including Molten Skin for Broken Fall. Now the theme decks were a black-red called Critical Mass, a white-blue called Sortami's Wisdom, a red-green called Spirit Flame, and a white-green called Truth Seekers. Now let's talk about some of the cards from this set. There was Pithing Needle. Now Pithing Needle, when it comes into play, you choose a card. You name a card. When a card of that name would activate an ability, you prevent that ability from being activated if it's not a mana ability. Basically, activated abilities on that chosen card can't be activated. Irario's Sortami Ascendant. When the 4th spell is played in a turn, you flip it into Irario's Essence, which is the first spell an opponent plays on a turn gets countered. And this, of course, is each of your opponents. So each of your opponents, first time they play a spell on their turn, countered. Ebony Owl Netsuke. If an opponent would have 7 or more cards in their hand at the beginning of their upkeep, Ebony Owl Netsuke does 4 damage to them. Ayumi, the Last Visitor. It has legendary Landwalk. Pretty simple there. It's a Landwalk ability, which kind of was dying out by now. Choice of Damnation. You have target opponent choose a number. That opponent loses that much life. Or, if you choose not to have them lose that much life, that opponent sacrifices down to all but that many permanents. So effectively, you can either have an opponent lose a great deal of life or save a lot of permanents. It's going to be their choice. It's a choice of damnation. Death Denied. Return X creature cards from your graveyard to your hand. Dense Canopy. Creatures with flying can only block creatures with flying. It basically means that ground to ground, flying to flying. Hitagetsu's Second Right. This kind of goes with Heartless Hitagetsu a little bit. If target player has exactly 10 life, Hitagetsu's Second Right does 10 damage to them. I have only managed to play this card one time, but I do have it in a deck because, well, if someone has exactly 10 life, you do 10 damage to them for pretty cheap and kill them. It's oddly specific, but hey, sometimes that works. Homura, Human Ascendant. It can't block, it's a 4/4, but when it be placed in the graveyard from play, you return to play flipped. It becomes Homura's Essence. Creatures you control get +2/+2 flying, and have the ability, 1 red mana, this creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn. You turn all your creatures into dragons if you can get Homura to die. In Name as One. When Name as One enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a spirit card and put it into play. You shuffle your library afterward. When a Name at Once dies and is put into the graveyard, you may return target spirit from your graveyard to play, under your control. So effectively, you get a spirit either way with it. Kaho, Minamo Historian. When Kaho comes into play, you search your library for up to 3 instant cards and remove from the game. Shuffle your library for afterwards. For X and tapping Kaho, you can play a instant exiled with Kaho with a converted mana cost of X without paying its normal mana cost. So effectively you can search for 3 instants and you don't have to have the exact mana to play them, but you can pay X and cast them. Kami the Crescent Moon. At the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws a card. Basically everybody draws an extra card. Kataki, War's Wage. All artifacts have, at the beginning of the upkeep, you must pay 1 colorless mana or sacrifice this permanent. Kuan, Ogre's Ascendant. At the beginning of your end step, or 3 or more creatures died, you flip it. And then it has Kuan's Essence, is what it becomes, and this is At the beginning of each player's upkeep, the player must sacrifice a creature. Michiko Kondo, Truth Seeker. Whenever a source an opponent control will deal damage to you, that source's controller sacrifices a permanent. Mikokoro, Center of the Sea. You can tap it for 1 colorless mana, or for 2 tap, each player draws a card. Mirror in the Moaning Well. Tap for adding 1 colorless mana to your mana pool, or 3 tap, sacrifice a creature, gain life equal to that sacrificed creature's toughness. Oni of the Wild Plains. At the beginning of your upkeep, you return a red creature you control to its owner's hand. So this is the kind of red creature that makes you basically bounce a creature back out. A red bouncer. Pure Intentions. When a spell or ability an opponent controls would cause you to discard a card, you may return that card to your hand. If a spell or ability opponent controls would cause you to discard Pure Intentions, at the end of the turn, you may return Pure Intentions to your hand. Reki. History of Kamigawa. When you cast a legendary spell, you may draw a card. Reverence. Creatures of power 2 or less cannot attack you. It keeps weenies from bothering you. Runetail Kisune Ascendant. When you have 30 or more life, you flip it to Runetail's Essence, which prevent all damage that be dealt to creatures you control. Sakura Tribe Scout. Tap, put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. Great way of getting some extra lands with just tapping a creature. Sasaya. Orochi Ascendant. Reveal your hand. If you have 7 or more lands in your hand, you flip Sasaya, and it becomes Sasaya's Essence, which, whenever you tap a land, for each land that shares a name with that land, you may add 1 mana that original land could produce to your mana pool. So if I have, example, I have 5 forests, I tap a forest, that forest taps for 5 mana. Taps for the 1 green it normally can do, taps for the 4 extra green for the 4 extra forests that exist, because that's what this forest can produce. It works with non-basic lands too, because they can produce different mana and tap them different mana. Seed the Land. Whenever a player plays a land, they put a 1/1 green snake creature token into play. You get some green snake tokens? Everybody does. And finally, Twincast. Copy target instant or sorcery. You choose new targets for that instant or sorcery. Simple as that. So, that's it for today. I introduced you to Saviors of Kamigawa, the last set in the Kamigawa block. Now, it continued a lot of the abilities it had, of course, in the previous sets and some of the confusing abilities. But truthfully speaking, it introduced a lot of great cards too. The essences, I enjoy many of them. Some of them are still powerful today. Other cards like Pithing Needle have been reprinted because they have their uses, especially in Standard, where there's a lot of common cards that are going around. So when it existed there, people loved it. So you can see that there was still greatness within this set, but with the continuation of the confusing abilities, the massive amount of legends, it just wasn't as strong as the Mirrodin block, or the Ravinica block, which we'll be talking about in a few weeks. Wasn't as strong, wasn't as powerful, wasn't as good. And comparing them is what makes it seem so bad. It's what kept it bad. So one of the reasons we may never visit Kamigawa again in a set. Maybe we can now with the new format that Magic has taken on, but it's impossible to say. Again, it had a great setting, great themes, great interests, and plenty of good cards that maybe some of you want to still play with. But regardless, if you have any questions, comments, anything you say, anything you think I left out, please leave in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. Show support the channel, the Empire of the Work I Do. If you want to show some extra support, you can always check out my Patreon. Link in the description below. Helps to improve, grow the channel. You can do that too, supporting it. If you want to see some other great Magic the Gathering content, I can always recommend you to my friends of the multiverse, Card Bazaar, They Said, We Said, and Tasty Snackies. Those 3 guys do some awesome, great stuff. They're cool dudes. You want to check out their stuff. I definitely recommend it. But regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.